It's snowing outside.
Terrible. It's the
Special
middle of November.
remembrances concerning snow and beauty and consolation on
I
New York.
love snow. I grew up in New York. There were maybe 2 snowstorms every winter. When a big, dirty, busy, crowded city is completely snowed in, there's no greater beauty than walking down Canal Street or Fifth Avenue, which has only happened 2 or 3 times in my life. There was a big snow in 1947, which I remember I was 6 years old. There was one a few years ago. When you can walk down Fifth Avenue and there isn't a car on it, and it's just the quiet snow, that's as beautiful as anything else. But that's the union of art and nature. And the union of art and nature is beauty.
Well, we can discuss beauty and consolation in nature and evolution, in mankind, in music, in contingency.
Sure, fine.
Let's start with Joe DiMaggio.
What about him?
Well, you tell me.
Hard to convey to Dutch audiences, but there must be comparable football heroes. The thing about Joe DiMaggio, he was the center fielder for the New York Yankees when I was a kid. I was born in 1941. 1951 was the last year he played. Center fielder is the major position in the outfield of a baseball field. Traditionally, the center fielder is the big hitter, the hero of the team. It's not always the case, but most of the great batters in the history of baseball have played the outfield. Many have played center field. DiMaggio is, in fact, he's still alive, just as elegant as ever in his mid-80s now. DiMaggio was just the most gracious player you've ever seen. He was a man of another age. The current world of celebrities, everybody has an ego as high as the moon, had nothing to do with DiMaggio. DiMaggio had a kind of natural elegance and grace. It didn't come from his background. He was a working-class kid from San Francisco. His family were Italian fishermen. He had ended up owning a seafood restaurant in San Francisco that did well, but it didn't come from a gentleman's background or anything. I think he just had a wonderful natural grace. He was a great player. He was a great hitter. He was a great fielder, but it was more than that.
What is the grace? His movements, his
Yes, style. He would, for example, if you watch modern baseball, almost every player today will make plays look more difficult than they actually are. That is, if a ball is difficult to catch, they'll tumble over or they'll stretch more than they have to. They just make it look hard. Mm-hmm. In American slang, it's called hot dogging, which means making it look harder than it is, making you look better than you really are. DiMaggio is the exact opposite. He would make everything look easy. Whenever there was a hard ball to catch, he would just run and he'd be there and he'd understate it. And of course, he had a very interesting life. He was married to Marilyn Monroe, as you know, among other things.
Great example.
Yeah. And so, of course, for a young male in New York at the time, he was the consummate hero. When I met him once, because I did an American Science show in the early 80s about me, and I was since, as you well know from our previous context, I don't do a lot of television. I don't particularly care for it. I was initially balking. I didn't want to do it. And they said, what's the one thing we could do that would get you to do it? And I said, well, you arrange an interview with Joe DiMaggio so I can meet him, and then I'll do the show. And they did it. So I did meet him once, and I must say, and I brought my son to see him, who was a baseball fan, and he really matched all my thoughts and hopes about him. The grace and the dignity is
Gentle,
is
modest.
real. Yeah, he's a wonderful man. Just one little incident. You may remember there was a major earthquake in San Francisco a few years ago. DiMaggio still lives in San Francisco, and he lives in the Marina District, which is an area of reclaimed land that was very severely hit by the earthquake, and his house was severely damaged. And for people whose houses were damaged, you had to go down the next day and wait on a long line to get whatever help you're going to get. And he just went down there, an old man in his late 70s then, early 80s. And he was waiting online like everyone else. He didn't ask for any special privilege. And finally, after he'd been waiting for a long time, somebody said, hey, you're Joe DiMaggio, don't you? And I think that they wanted. But he wasn't going to ask for anything. Can you imagine any modern baseball player doing that? And I think it just came natural to DiMaggio. It's the kind of man he is. And no, he was a wonderful player. There's also a personal part to it when, as you probably know, when a baseball is hit into the stands, that is into the audience, whoever catches it gets to keep it. And of course, it's very rare to get one. I mean, there could be 50,000 people at a game. 20 or 30 balls are hit into the stands. Well, my father was a court stenographer, and we didn't have much money, so when we went to the game, we usually sat way up in the third deck where balls don't come. But some of the judges had season tickets and had very good seats. Every once in a while, my father would get the judges' tickets because he was a court stenographer, and then we could sit very close. And one day in 1949, we had these wonderful seats, and DiMaggio was up, and he hit a little pop foul right towards us, and it's like one of those frozen moments. It only could have taken a second or two, but I remember the ball was coming right at us, and I said, Dad, catch it. And he said, you never get balls. But he put his hand up, and the ball fell right in. We got it. And we mailed it to DiMaggio, and he signed it and sent it back. And that, of course, made me the neighborhood hero. DiMaggio was like God. I would tell kids in the neighborhood I have a ball signed by Joe DiMaggio, and they would say, oh, go on, you must be kidding. That's absurd. No, it's like having a ball signed by God. And then I'd bring him into the house and show him this, and there it was. So that's Joe DiMaggio.
So for a start, Beauty and Consolation, Joe DiMaggio.
Beauty and Consolation, yes, that's actually a good example, because if you want to talk about the essence of Beauty and Consolation, and I'm sure just about everyone else in your series will say the same thing, what is the essence of human beauty and consolation? We live in a universe that is often not working the way we'd like it to, and why should it? It wasn't constructed for us. After all, the Earth's 4.5 billion years old, and life's 3.5 billion years old, and humans have been here for a couple 100,000 years, and although there's a lot of joy and pleasure in life, there's also a lot of necessary pain and mystery and disappointment and sadness, and so because this universe was not made by God for us, and therefore a lot about it is very confusing, and And there's a lot of sadness. There's also a lot of joy. But because of that, we have to construct meaning, and that's beauty and consolation. We find beauty, in part because our brains are built to perceive it. We need to find consolation, and there are many ways in which we do it. Well, one of the ways is sport, is entertainment, in the deep and legitimate sense of it. That is, we construct institutions like sports, which have where nobody gets killed. See, that's the beauty of sports. That's why it's consolation. You, as a child, even as an adult, you can root for the New York Yankees. You can love the New York Yankees. If they fail one year, your heart can be broken. But it's only for a couple of days, and nobody dies. And if they win, it can be the most exciting, exalting thing in the world, but it doesn't kill anybody on the other side. See, that's real consolation. It's not phony. It's not artificial. It's just constructing a world in which all the emotions of joy and disappointment can be expressed, where you can really love, where DiMaggio can be here. I don't know the personal Joe DiMaggio. I did meet him once, and in a way it doesn't matter. I don't know whether he's a nice man all the time. I'm sure he has faults and human foibles like everybody else. I'm sure he had a hard time with Marilyn Monroe because she was a difficult woman.
Sure. Yeah.
But that's a different point. There's two different Joe DiMaggios, you see. There's Joe DiMaggio, the human being, who's fascinating, and I might want to read about him in a biography. But Joe DiMaggio, the ball player, Joe DiMaggio, the center fielder of the New York Yankees, Joe DiMaggio, who wrote this hagiographical autobiography, Lucky to Be a Yankee, that's a different figure. It's just, see, America as a country is too young to have mythic heroes, and therefore we have to use real human beings to construct mythic heroes, and that's why there was a man named Abraham Lincoln, and it's nice to know about him, but there's also a myth named Abraham Lincoln. The myth of Abraham Lincoln is the man who grew up in a log cabin. I mean, that's not false. The myth of Abraham Lincoln is the man who walked 3 or 4 miles to give 2 pennies back to a lady he'd shortchanged by accident. Probably didn't happen, but even if it did, it's still part of the myth. And I think you don't want to mix those up. That you want to acknowledge there's a human Abe Lincoln, there's a human Joe DiMaggio, you want to know about them, but the myth is real too, and that's beauty and consolation. So I think it's not a trivial starting point, Joe DiMaggio, and in that sense, I think much of what is most noble and most edifying about human institutions, our arts, our literature, our music, our sports, our excellences, they are complex social constructions that exist for beauty and consolation. That's why the title of your topic is such a good one. It really does capture something very essential about human needs and the human status in this universe.
Which scientific ideas would you say represent for you beauty and consolation?
Well, the one I chose, obviously, it's why I went in that direction. Evolution always fascinated me more than anything else. That's I guess, a pretty common career path for paleontologists. That is, when you're young, at age 5, I got fascinated with dinosaurs. I didn't know anything about evolution or the theories of this. I mean, I knew they were big, fierce, and extinct and wonderful creatures, and they lived a long time ago, and I guess I vaguely knew that life changed and that the Earth was very old. But that wouldn't have sustained me. That's not enough. I mean, most kids who get fascinated with dinosaurs leave it. They don't stick with it that long. But then when I was a young teenager, I discovered evolutionary theory, mainly through reading the works of George Gaylord Simpson, the great paleontologist of the last generation. No, and evolution always thrilled me as a concept. It's so broad in scope. I guess the greatest...
What's its
I don't know whether
beauty?
its beauty is the depth of time. It's the understanding that human history is an eye blink of this geological immensity. It's getting some insight from the standpoint of a species that has lived for just a moment of the history of the Earth, to actually have intellectual tools that enable you to probe and understand a good deal of what's happened over millions and billions before we even existed on this planet. I mean, that's a really exciting concept, and I always did find it thrilling and fascinating, and to even have some sense of the principles and the scientific mechanisms by which evolutionary change occurred, I mean, by which an ape could eventually change and become a human, by which millions of species of insects live on this planet today. Now, that was always very exciting. It just seemed so much grander than anything that human life could have achieved in so short a time. Now, that's why when I started doing the essay series in 1974, which I'm still writing, I've now written about 270 essays every month and never missed one, but I used, the general title is This View of Life, but I got that from the last line of The Origin of Species, where Darwin says there is grandeur in this view of life. That is the evolutionary view, because it is so broad, because it talks about... And then what he says is interesting, because he kind of takes a dig at Isaac Newton, and what had been seen as most grand about science in the 17th and 18th century was the grandeur of celestial mechanics, the law-like movement of the planets. See, but what Darwin says is this grandeur in this view of life, that is the evolutionary perspective, because while in the Newtonian world the planets just go on cycling endlessly, there's no direction, there's no pattern, he says, while this is happening, the old grandeur of the physical universe, and then he contrasts that with the directionality, the constant change of biological evolution. He says, from so humble a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That's a direct quote. That's the last line. And that's the grandeur in this view of life, that it all moves forward, that it develops this diversity of millions of species from a bacterial starting point. And that's so different from the endless cycling of the planets, which just go round and round and round.
Still remember yourself as a kid?
Oh, yeah, quite well,
Slowly
actually. Yeah, I have better and more complete memories of childhood than most people do. Probably because it was basically a happy and uncomplicated childhood.
Yeah, but you're wondering about the universe, about the endless
Oh yeah,
time.
right. Yeah, no, I think it's
Give me an
common.
impression. That's
I think it's.
Stevie J.
No, I
12,
remember.
13, 14.
I remember well. I know 8 or 9, 9 or 10. But I think if you talk to intellectual kids, you'll find that there's nothing unusual about this. I remember Carl Sagan told me that he had very similar thoughts, and I think most people did. But I remember I would lie awake at night, or before I went to sleep. I mean, I wasn't insomniac over it. And I would think about eternity and infinity, the great questions, which we really don't know how to think about. I don't think anyone to this day. In fact, the human mind may just not be capable of thinking about such concepts in maximally fruitful ways, which may be why we don't understand it very well. But I would think, and I think about it the way an 8 or a 9-year-old would. Like, I think about the infinity of the universe. If it is infinite, I'd say, well, it's got to end somewhere, because everything ends. So I guess if you just flew away from the world in a rocket ship, you'd eventually come to a brick wall, and that would be the end of it. But then, of course, what's on the other side of the brick wall? And how could it ever end? And I wouldn't get anywhere. And then I'd think about eternity, and I'd say, well, there has to be a beginning. The earth had to have a beginning. Everything has a beginning. And some people say God began it, but that's not an answer, because then what began God? Or did God live forever? Or who's God anyway? So, and I realized that I could not, given the way an 8-year-old mind's work, I could not escape the concept of eternity and infinity, and I couldn't comprehend it either. And I'm not sure that we've ever gotten beyond that. And it may be a limitation of human mentality. There may be fruitful ways to contemplate these issues that we just can't access given the way our minds work.
But the sense of beauty, of the whole infinite universe, was this sense of beauty already present?
Well, that's a hard one, because I think there are aspects of what we call sense of beauty that are quite universal and probably have something to do with the structure of the mind.
Yeah.
Symmetries, geometries. I mean, why is it that we perceive a symmetrical face as beautiful and a very asymmetrical or distorted face as ugly? That's probably deep, and it's probably very biological, because other animals also reject deformed. And why do we take pleasure in some of the geometrical regularities that even the Greeks discovered? Why does the so-called golden section appeal to us? I mean, basically, it's the golden section. The logarithmic spiral is a curve that expands without changing its shape. But why? I don't know why we find that appealing. Why do certain proportions appeal to us and certain not? So there are aspects of beauty that are probably intrinsic, and they probably are. And this is where accident comes in. I don't believe the brain was adaptively designed to see beauty in geometric regularity. I think that's just an odd spin-off of a brain that evolved that way for other reasons. I mean, why is it that that chromatic music stirs certain emotions in us, whereas music in a series of tonic and dominant chords feels martial to us? I don't know, and I don't think that's just cultural. I think that there's something about the openness of a dominant chord followed by the tonic that that stirs thoughts of transcendence. I think there's something about chromaticism that stirs thoughts of sadness. I don't know why, but composers learn that and they fool people with it.
Und die Kriegsknechte fluchten eine Krone von Dornen und satzten sie auf sein Haupt und legten ihm ein Purpurkleid an und sprachen: im Backenstreiche. Da ging Pilatus wieder heraus und sprach zu ihnen: Siehet, ich führe ihn heraus zu euch, dass ihr erkennet, dass ich keine Schuld an ihm finde. Also ging Jesus heraus und trug eine Dornenkrone und Purpurkleid, und er sprach zu ihnen: Siehet, welch ein Mensch! Da ihn die hohen Priester und Diener sahen, schrien sie und sprachen: Kreuzige, kreuzige!
Give you a quote from Steven Weinberg.
Okay.
You know him.
Sure.
Good friend or
Good colleague.
We believe that if we ask why the world is the way it is, and then ask why that answer is the way it is, at the end of this chain of explanations we shall find a few simple principles of compelling beauty. As we look beneath the surface of things, we find more and more beauty. We would not accept any theory as final unless it were beautiful.
Well, that's, with all due respect to my wonderful colleague Steve Weinberg, that's almost a circular statement because it really has to do with the definition of beauty. You see, anything that really gave us insight, that was a genuine principle, in that sense we would call beautiful because it would strike us as beautiful. And therefore it really doesn't say a lot except that we would mentally and emotionally regard as beautiful any true principle about nature that taught us, that gave us insight into things. Now what it seems to be saying is something deeper that I disagree with, but in fact I think it's wrong. As a physicist, what it seems to be saying is that the essence of beauty is in simple, probably mathematical, law-like statements that generate the complexities of nature. That the real beauty is in E equals mc squared or the inverse square law. And of course I don't think that's right, or let's just say it's not adequate. There's nothing wrong about that. There are some remarkably simple natural laws that yield a lot of nature's order, and we do see those as beautiful for their simplicity. The notion that something simple can generate that much complex is a notion that strikes the human mind as beautiful. However, there's a lot else out there in nature which is also beautiful in a different way. Let me give you an obvious example. It may seem trivial, but you know the universe isn't as mathematically regular as physicists sometimes claim it is. In fact, in the one place where mathematical regularity would really be most practically useful to us, we don't have any. That's why calendars are so complex. It would really be useful if there were an even number of days in the year, for example. That's how we make calendars. I mean, we're bound to notice that there are days, that is, rotations of the Earth, and there are years, which are revolutions of the Earth, and there are months, which are lunations, or movements of the moon around the Earth. And calendars, which are very important, and which have regulated a lot of intellectual struggle in human history, are very difficult because there's no regularity in the cycles. There are 365.24 and a zillion decimal points days in the year. You can't make a nice, simple, even calendar. I mean, the Julian calendar worked pretty well, where you had a leap year every 4 years. That's complex enough with the damn leap year, but it isn't 365 and a quarter. It's 365.24. And so the Julian calendar overestimates by 11 minutes a year, which you wouldn't think would make a difference, but it does. It accumulates. And so you had to have this Gregorian reform in the 16th century where you knock out leap years in 3 out of every 4 centuries. It's very complicated. When you try and correlate solar and lunar calendars, it's even worse because the lunar month is 29 and a half days. And the only way you can get the lunar year in sync with the solar year is to run through the so-called metonic cycle where you have in 7 out of each 19 years, you add a leap month, a 13th lunar month, and then it works out. It's horrendously complex. You know, as I like to say, I say this somewhat facetiously, God is either arcane or mathematically incompetent or just a jokester, or he doesn't exist. I mean, no other God would have made such an inconvenient set of natural cycles. But that's beautiful, too, in a way. I mean, it's because of that we have a whole history of calendrics that's so interesting. It's because of that we have all this interest in the coming millennium that I just wrote a book about. This is all because calendars are complicated. And then, as you know, from my standpoint, of course, what I see is most beautiful, and this is where I disagree with Steve. And Steve doesn't disagree with that. This is just a question of what we focus on. That is, Steve would not argue that every detail of the history of life can be directly deduced from these laws. Steve Weinberg understands that the evolution of Homo sapiens is a detail that can only be understood by contingent history. He knows that. E equals mc squared and the inverse square law and the laws of nature are never going to give you the evolution of Homo sapiens. The famous statement of Laplace, of course, is wrong. The famous statement that if you could only tell me the position and motion of every atom in the universe at any time in the past, I could give you an entire deterministic future account. That's the great Laplacian vision. That gives rise to the famous legend. It's false, but it's a great legend that when Napoleon, having been presented with Laplace's 5-volume Celestial Mechanics, asked him how he could write a book like about the workings of the universe and not make any single reference to God, the author of nature. Now, Laplace supposedly said, "Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis." Now, it never happened. That's not the point. The point is the legend exists because the story exists because Laplace is supposed to be this pure determinist. You don't need a hypothesis like God. Everything's in the laws of nature. Well, that's not right. There's a lot of randomness, real randomness. There's a lot of contingency, which requires narrative explanation. And I think that's beautiful. See, I think it's just as beautiful that from the inverse square law you can deduce a lot about the nature of solar systems and galaxies. I think it's just as beautiful that from the odd, unrepeatable contingencies of history along a particular pathway that would never occur again, if you could run the tape all over again, that along that pathway we have evolved Homo sapiens, and we have also evolved rhinoceroses and dung beetles and a whole bunch of other fascinating things. To me, that's just as beautiful. That's beauty. And that's why I say the statement's less meaningful than it sounds, because whatever principle we discovered that gave us deep insight into why nature works, we would call it beautiful. We call the extreme opposites beautiful. We call it beautiful when a simple mathematical principle gives us insight. We call it beautiful when we understand something as the result of unrepeatable complex contingency.
Yeah.
So I think it's just talking about human psychology. Michelangelo's Last Judgment, also beautiful. Why is it beautiful? It's beautiful for that incredible detail that's up there. It's beautiful because St. Bartholomew holds his flayed skin, and the flayed skin is a portrait of Michelangelo, and that's a joke, and we laugh, and that's beautiful too. Now, beauty is also in the intimate, intricate detail of things that are unique and that are unrepeatable. It's beautiful, although it's awesome and terrible that 65 million years ago this enormous thing struck the earth and killed off all the dinosaurs and gave mammals a chance. It's awesome. It's terrifying. But there's a kind of cold beauty in that as well. And that's just a detail of history that made our lives possible.
Und von Stund an nahm sie der Jünger zu sich. Danach, als Jesus wusste, dass schon alles vollbracht war, was die Schrift erfüllt würde, spricht ich dürstet. Da stund ein Gefäß voll Essigs, sie füllten aber einen Schwamm mit Essig und legten ihm einen Esopen und hielten es ihm dar zum Munde. Da nun Jesus den Essig genommen hatte, sprach er: Es ist vollbracht.
Many of the participants of Beauty and Consolation, I have the idea that the sense of ordering, to order the world, is ahead of understanding.
Well, but ordering is understanding. I mean, we may be wrong.
You start
Yes, it's an
ordering and
understanding.
then you can understand.
But ordering is a form of understanding. Please understand. Please realize that when I say understanding, I don't mean we're necessarily right. Most understandings in the history of science turn out to be wrong. All I say is there's a sense of beauty and order in the feeling that we understand. And yes, ordering is often a first prerequisite. That is, you look at a bat and you say, hey, wait a minute, this has hair. It's not like those other birds. It really looks more like a rat and those other things we call mammals. Then you have a sense, then you say, my God, how did it get wings? Where did that come from? And then you start thinking about it. Yeah, so in that sense, correct ordering can precede proper understanding.
And there's perhaps a deep source of beauty and consolation.
I think so. Yeah, see, I think a lot of questions like that really depend upon individual psychology. There is a eureka myth, of course. I don't mean myth in the sense of falsity. I mean myth in the sense of grand legend, which of course comes from Archimedes jumping out of his bath and shouting, "Eureka! I found it," through the streets of Syracuse when he finally figured out how to measure the amount of gold by volume displacement in the king's crown. I'm sure it didn't happen. All those things are legends, but and some people do work that way. Some people have more volatile personalities. That is, they have a moment of discovery in which the heavens open and declare the glory of God or whatever. Other people have different psychologies. I happen to have a more phlegmatic psyche. I don't work that way. I don't have moments of great enlightenment when I want to just jump up and kiss anyone I see in the hallway. I don't work that way. In fact, in those few times in my life when I think at a single moment I finally understood something, I'm more likely to say, oh, so that's how it goes. That's nice. That's interesting. That's how it goes. And then it sort of dawns on you later, the implications. So I think eureka feelings come out of a certain psychology that I don't seem to go by, but I would share the feeling of most of my colleagues that in science, the moments of greatest beauty and consolation are where you feel that you have personally made sense and order and have properly understood in terms of its causes aspects of the diversity of nature that had been puzzling beforehand. My technical work, as you know, is on a genus of land snails from the West Indies named Sirion. Just to give you an example, it's a trivial little example, but I went to the island of San Salvador last year. I spent a week doing field work there. Now, San Salvador is an interesting island because where Columbus first landed. Otherwise, it's like every other Bahamian island. But because it's well known historically for that reason, there's been more scientific study there. There's a biological station there. People have been studying the Sirions there for 20 years, but they're not experts on Sirions. They're geologists who want to know so they can figure out the geology of San Salvador. And the Sirion's difficult on San Salvador. It's very puzzling. There's a lot of hybridization. There aren't clear species. But I've had 20 or 30 years experience working with the Sirions. And when I got there, in a couple days, I realized what the problem was. There was an unidentified species on the island that had not been recognized because it hybridizes with the other major species, so you never get a pure population. And it was nobody's fault that they hadn't noticed it, because there's no place on the island where you just get this one thing looking very different from everything else. But because I've studied them for 20 years, I know that species like this live in a certain environment. I know how they hybridize with the other kind of species. I know where to look. And within 2 days, I had sorted out that island, and to the satisfaction of people who seemed pleased with what I'd figured out. And I wrote that up, and I published it, and I named a new species. It's of no major scientific significance, but it was so satisfying to be able to be there for a few days, to use 20 years of expertise, to use a pattern that I had understood because I saw how it worked on other islands, to solve a problem that they had been unable to solve because they again, I'm not criticizing anyone. They can solve geological problems that I can't solve because they know the geology. I can solve Sirion problems because I know the taxonomy of that. Now, that's a tiny little example. That paper I published will never be cited by more than half a dozen people. It doesn't establish any new principles, but it is, I'm convinced, a correct solution to the problem of Sirion's variation on that island. And that's exciting. That is beauty. That consolation is consolation in the sense that life is confusing. And when you, through your own experience and intellect, can rest, that's a W-R-E-S-T, not an R-E-S-T, that is, can grab, can take from nature a little bit of order out of that chaos, that's very satisfying.
What's the beauty of the Sirion, of the snails?
Evolutionary biologists love diversity. That's why we get into the field. Sirion is probably...
You've got an example here. You can show it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah?
Yeah. I have to
take one, or
you'd have to let me go around.
you go. Get one.
Get one. I have to get the diversity. Remember, we only got half an hour. Now, see, you ask about beauty. This is the naturalist definition of beauty. Sirion is the most diverse land snail in the world. That is, there's more anatomical variation, I think, than in any other shell. This is the largest single. I found this on the island of Mayaguana in the Bahamas. This is actually the largest shell of Sirion that has ever been found. Now, this is one of the smallest. Look at that difference in size. You don't get that difference in size in most genera of animals. That is, the smallest and largest human are nowhere near that different one from the other. And look at the differences in shape. I mean, you get some that are tall and thin, like a pencil here. And you get others that have flat tops, look more like a golf ball or a square. Look at that. So these are just different species. This one's from Cuba. This one's from the Exumas in the Bahamas. They're not that far apart. Now, see, that's beauty to an evolutionary biologist because we love diversity. This is a wonderful example of nature's diversity. And, of course, if you're an evolutionary biologist, the main thing you want to know is how do you get that diversity? Why is it there? I don't claim to have solved all of that, but it's a thrill to work on problems like that.
Yeah, contingency and diversity.
A lot
Those
of
are the
it.
code words of...
Yeah, that's a large part of a naturalist beauty. But I'm not insensible to Weinberg's form of beauty. That is, when a simple underlying principle can explain a lot of diversity. That happens too.
What did you learn from the snails?
That there are sensible and meaningful correlations between environments and shell form. That the older view was that the variation in shell form from island to island was completely random. They were just blown around by hurricanes. It didn't make any sense at all. Nobody could find any rhyme or reason to it. It was called a crazy quilt. And working with ecologist and geneticist colleague David Woodruff in San Diego, we were able to show, after many years of fieldwork, that in fact that's not true. There are definite patterns of order. There is a certain amount of just blowing around, and who knows why, but there are definite colors and definite shell forms that occur in particular places. And when you do get different species, they tend to interbreed with each other and hybridize, so you can trace them out and follow their patterns. And yes, the excitement there was to discover order where people had previously claimed there was nothing but random disorder. But it isn't the order of simple physical laws, it's the order of history's pattern. The most beautiful things for me are better understandings of how evolution works. I am trying, as you know, to write a quite comprehensive book to be called The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. And to me, that's actually a personal definition that in a couple of years I will be able to gather in one volume my view of how evolution works. Is to me a great consolation because it represents the putting together of a lifetime of thinking into one source. That book will never be particularly widely read. It's going to be far too long, and it's only for a few thousand professionals, very different from my popular science writings, but it's a greater consolation to me because it's a chance to put in one place a whole way of thinking about evolution that I've struggled with all my life.
Yeah, the moment you have finished the book.
Oh, then you go on to the next
You're
book.
working with the typewriter, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, last famous statement. Bam, book is ready. What kind of feeling is that?
It's,
It has been so
as I told you,
important.
no, as I told you, I'm phlegmatic. At that point, I say, "Oh, that's nice. and go on.
I don't know. Now
Yes,
I don't believe you.
no,
Not
absolutely.
a book like that.
No, but
you're working on it the
of
whole
course.
lifetime.
But Vin, what's the difference between the end point? The end point's no different than 10 minutes before.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. That's a myth. Eureka's a myth. If you've worked on something for 20 years, it's organic. And when you type the last period and write Laus Deo, praise God, under it, or whatever you do, it's no different from 20 minutes before when you were composing the last paragraph. It's just the end point.
Then you send it away to the publisher.
Yeah.
It's out in the open.
Right.
It's finished.
Yeah, that's nice. Go on
That's
to the
all?
next book.
That's all.
Yeah.
Don't believe you.
No, but no, you're missing.
Now you're exaggerating.
No, because you're missing you're missing the egotism in it. The whole process is exciting.
Yeah.
The end point is meaningless. The whole thing is full of meaning. There's no artificiality of the final point. There is no end to it. That is, there's only a next book. I mean, this is only a way station. Everything's a way station.
How much consolation is there in dying itself? And I mean it from an evolutionary point of
dying
view.
is terrible. It's just, we can't help it. It just works that way. There's no consolation at all. I mean, it's much of human.
No
lot
death,
of,
no change.
no. Look, I accept that given the way biology works, if there wasn't death, you wouldn't have evolution. But that's no consolation to the fact that one's father dies and one's loved ones die. That's no consolation at all, because the pain of the death of a loved one is totally different. That comes out of human psychology. You can accept. That's what I meant when we were talking earlier about there isn't solace in the factuality of nature. Nature doesn't care about us. Nature is indifferent to our hopes and sufferings. Nature is beautiful because there's pattern out there, but not because nature intrinsically offers consolation. We have to seek consolation itself. That is, I can appreciate, and it's even true, the argument that death is necessary for evolution to occur, but that doesn't make the pain of death any less. The pain of death is the greatest of all human pains. And there's nothing's ever going to take that away. We will always be devastated because there are people we love and who are close to us, and they die, and we will miss them. And therefore, we construct art, and we construct religion. We construct a lot of our institutions as ways of dealing with that.
There's not a feeling, the abstraction, perhaps, of this continually dying of all these species, making change possible, in itself has a kind of sheer beauty.
Yes, but it's that harsh beauty. Nature has all this harsh beauty, which is irrelevant to human hopes. And that's one of them. That is, we can appreciate that without a history of mass extinction and death and recycling, you would never get humans here. So the fact of our existence we owe evolutionarily.
The parade dying.
Yeah, and that is, there's a kind of fierce and cold beauty to that, but it is not psychological consolation at all. Or if it is, I think it's a false consolation. It doesn't help me to come to terms with missing my father and my brother, that I understand that death is an evolutionary necessity. I mean, so what? I'd still rather they were here.
Your father dying, your brother dying. What kind of consolation did you seek for at those moments?
There isn't any. You just live through it. I think the only that's the rationalist perspective that if you understand, and when Spinoza said that freedom is the recognition of necessity, that famous paradoxical line that goes through, I don't know, the Spinoza said it first, usually attributed to him. That's the rationalist solace is to understand that there isn't deep meaning. Your father didn't die to punish you or to punish him or because he'd done anything wrong, and he didn't die too young because he'd done anything bad. That's just how life works. There are these sadnesses. There is, ironically and paradoxically, there is
you have to deal with the triviality.
There is consolation in knowing that there is no cosmic consolation. It's just what happens.
There, behind the door, is a lecture announced about immortality.
Immortality?
Immortality. If we talk about beauty and consolation, the greatest punishment could be immortality.
Well, but it has no meaning as a concept. Immortality is a psychic bomb. It's a concept we invented because death is so painful. I think immortality can be given certain meanings, but what can the concept mean? Even the planet isn't going to last more than a few billion years. The sun's going to explode. The earth will disappear. Immortality, in a functional sense, means that through your good works and your thoughts and your achievements, that your name and work lives on for a long time. It's
religion. People believing, hundreds of billions of people believing in immortality, an afterlife, heaven.
That's the ultimate consolation, right?
Yeah.
And I would not try and deny it to anyone, but I can't believe it myself.
No, how ridiculous is the idea, being immortal? What, to paraphrase, how would the angels have to sing for us to be eternally blessed?
Sweetly. Not rap music, I hope, because eternity listening to rap music would be perhaps not worth living. Even Bach and Tata, since there are only 200 of them, might fade in eternity. God, if you had to listen to even Wachet auf every 196 weeks or whatever for true eternity, I don't know.
But there is something very odd. People looking for consolation, the
Well,
final consolation of immortality.
But there's a reason for that, and the reason is that death is the scariest, most frightening of all things, of all inevitable things that we face.
Yeah, but immortality is even a greater a punishment.
Not given the fear of death. Immortality.
You're a rationalist.
I don't know. I may be a rationalist, but I'm also a human, and enough of an egotist to think that if there look, as I said, the mind can't really encompass true eternity. So I think immortality, though it's framed in those terms psychologically, doesn't really mean that. Immortality means that when you've experienced the pain of the death of a loved one, that might be reconcilable at some time in the future, that you might see that person again, that you might be with them. I don't think, even though conventional religion, at least conventional Christianity, talks about immortality, I don't know what concept of it most people have. I think for most people it's the solace of reversing the loss of death. And of expiating the fear of one's personal death, the most frightening thing we can contemplate.
Did you ever manage to reconcile with the death of your father, a beloved one, your brother?
It's just by...
What is the reconciliation?
There isn't any.
No.
Just by knowing there's no particular sense to it. It's just how biology works, and there's no way around it.
Ich folge dir gleichfalls mit freudiger
as a Jew, it's quite paradoxical for someone to sing the St. John Passion, which is a really anti-Semitic text, so much more so than the other three Gospels which were written earlier. So in a way, if somebody of Jewish background can see such enormous beauty and consolation in the St. John Passion, it's just the ability to transcend this historical context. Obviously, I see no reason to blame Bach for working within a historical context of his time, and the fact that this ugliness of the text can be so perfectly transcended is a testimony to the universality of great music. But it is beauty and consolation that epitomizes. I almost could think that you devised this title for the series because you were thinking of the great Bach passions. The beauty, I suppose, is so primally inherent in the music. It hardly needs any words. It's whatever excerpts you show from the piece will illustrate that. I mean, here is one of the most tender and tragic myths of human history depicted by the greatest composer who ever lived. When you think of the enormous richness of the Passion, the stolid choral hymns that are sung, the evangelist intoning the narrative, the angry passages of the crowd, and then the beautiful arias that go in between. I think it's the arias that capture the greatest of the beauty. Some of them are so wonderfully innocent and charming. The first soprano aria, ich folge dir gleichfalls mit freudigen Schritten. I follow you with joyful steps, mein Leben, mein Licht, my light, my life. And in the bass you have this figure of the eighth notes descending throughout the piece, which are her steps, I assume, her joyful steps. It's so innocent, it's so beautiful. And you contrast that with just the incredible intensity and suffering and pain of the descriptions of the crucifixion itself, or just the little passages of the evangelist when Peter weeps bitterly after realizing that he had denied Christ 3 times, even though he promised he never would, before the cock crew, or the setting when Christ is beaten after he appears before Caiaphas, which is sung so beautifully by the evangelist, and the wonderful, expansive opening chorus, Herr, unser Herrscher. Just remarkable piece. That's beauty. That's easy to see. Consolation, I think, is in the story more than anything else. And again, it's...
What's the consolation of martyrdom?
Because yes, the consolation is the myth. Now here's one of the primal myths. I have to say, I don't believe it either historically or theologically, for that matter. But as a sheer story, consolation is this, that we live in this world of woe. We do things that we don't understand. We're driven to murder and mayhem and aggression. We don't understand any of it. We seek consolation for not being what we hoped we could be. We seek consolation for all the tragedies that unfold in anyone's lifetime, the death of family members, the death of children. And to think that we can construct a myth whereby an omnipotent God could incarnate himself in a human body and die to offer us redemption from these sins. As I say, I don't believe it for a moment, but I can't think of a better embodiment of our need for consolation, that we would construct a myth that an omnipotent God would allow a part of himself to be so frail and human that he would die, bleeding, suffer, bleeding, nailed to a cross in order that we may be saved. I think that's a stunning story. So that's consolation.
Yeah, but when you sing, through thy captivity, Son of God, we received our freedom. Thy dungeon is the mercy seat where thou dost free the godly. Hadst thou not entered slavery, we all were slaves eternally. What kind of a consolation is it? It's at the same time so absolutely weird.
Well, as I say, I'm willing to accept that's myth, that story. I'm not a Christian anyway, so I don't even have to deal with it.
You are Jew.
Yeah, no, I just simply accept that. And of course, that poem you just read is one of those doggerel hymn texts. It isn't as rich or as deep as the rest of the setting. It's just rhyming psalmody. No, I don't accept that part of it in any literal sense. I don't have that view of human beings. But again, I would assert that I know no better myth in human history than the notion that some force perfectly powerful should make a part of himself so weak and so suffering in order to save this creature that exists here on this earth, having evolved a brain uniquely capable of consciousness and therefore able to perceive all the difficulties and tragedies and joys of this planet.
Da kamen die Kriegsknechte und brachen dem ersten die Beine und dem anderen, der mit ihm gekreuziget war. Als sie aber zu Jesu kamen, da sie sahen, dass schon gestorben war, brachen sie ihm die Beine nicht, sondern der Kriegsknechte einer eröffnete seine Seite mit einem Speer, und alsobald ging Blut und Wasser heraus. Und der das gesehen hat, der hat es bezeuget, und sein Zeugnis ist wahr. Und derselbige weiß, dass die Wahrheit saget, auf dass ihr gläubet. Denn solches ist geschehen, auf dass die Schrift erfüllet würde. Ihr solltet ihm kein Bein zerbrechen. Abermals spricht eine andere Schrift, sie werden sehen, in welchen sie gestochen haben.
You are Jew, singing those texts of the St. John Passion. What kind of a feeling is it?
Oh,
I remember you talking about sein Blut komme über uns.
Oh
und
yeah,
unsere
no,
Kinder.
it's troubling. There's no question it's troubling. The worst. See, the problem is this: the St. Matthew Passion is not particularly anti-Semitic in its text, except it has the worst line in it: "Sein Blut sei über uns und unsere Kinder," His blood be on us and on our children, which is stated when Pilate washes his hands, and then the Jews answer, "Well, okay, his blood be on us." But other than that. There's not much, whereas in the John Passion you have this long passages about Pilate not wanting to do it and being sort of forced into it by the Jews, and then every conventional Jewish stereotype is there. The Jews are cowardly, that is, they want him put to death, but they won't do it themselves, so they beg Pilate to do it, and then they're hypocritical because when he proclaims them that Jesus is their king, he says, "No, we have no other king but Caesar." And so every stereotype that became so tragic in subsequent human history through its playing out is there. No, I think one simply has to say that you understand the historical context. It is nothing but tragic. If you change the words, which some people do, you both compromise art because then you can change anything. But more importantly, if you sanitize it and change the text, then you have nothing to talk about. If you keep the ugliness of history in there, then it's a challenge, then it's a focus, then you can talk, then you can argue, then you can discuss, then you can work these things out. I mean, if we rejected everyone in the past whose views we hold in abhorrence, you wouldn't have much music. I could never go to a Wagnerian opera again. I think he was a terrible man, but he wrote some of the most glorious music ever.
Und spricht zu den Juden: Sehet, das ist euer König. Sie schrien aber:
Wir haben keinen König, wir haben keinen König in dem Kreis.
Da überantwortete ihn das Bergekreuzigend Würde. Sie nahmen aber Jesum und führten ihn hin, und er trug sein Kreuz und ging hinaus zur Stätte, die da heißet Schädelstedt, welche heißet auf Hebräisch Golgatha.
When you're singing, you told me before that there's a kind of transformation, that you're part of the drama. You,
Oh,
yourself.
yes, there's...
You're not Steve Gould, but...
No, that's the... Outside of the purely musical pleasures, after I live a kind of life that's very personally focused. When I lecture, it's just me. I'm not even an actor acting with other people. It's just me alone. I don't do that much collaborative work. Even in my science, I do some, because you can't do major scientific projects without collaboration. But I lead this very personalized life, and I think in every human being, I think this probably is deep within our evolutionary heritage, there's desires for individuality and desires for belonging. Now, as a member of a chorus, you don't want to be distinctive. My voice, I don't have a distinctive voice anyway. I have a decent choral voice. My musicianship is adequate. I don't have a solo singing voice at all. But you don't want to stand out because you're part of a whole. You're part of an ensemble, and the chorus is only a small part of the whole, and we're part of the drama. At least in the John Passion, there's a lot of choral music, but we've sung Handel oratorios, for example, where you can sit for half an hour between, but choral, it doesn't matter, you're still part of it, you're getting ready, you get swept up in it. No, I think it's hard to put into words because it is emotional, and it's hard to describe, but I get a feeling sometimes, and you live for that, when everything works well, that I guess you'd have to call transcendence, maybe that goes with beauty and consolation, but among the few times in my life where I felt transcendence, it was usually in association with great musical moments. I remember singing the Berlioz Requiem and singing the bass line, the tuba mirum, against the 4 brass choirs and the 10 pairs of timpani. All that does is send a shiver down your spine. So there are moments, you live for those moments when everything works, and it's transporting. That's transcendence. Goes with beauty and consolation.
And it applies especially to music.
I think for me it does.
For you.
I guess for other people it's in art or in sports or in sex or in... I'm not incapable of finding it in all that, look, some great baseball games I've been to have had equal impact on me, but for me it mostly comes through music.
Can you remember the last time that music was a really consoling element?
When we sang Handel's great oratorio Jephthah, which is just such a heart-rending story about a man who makes an absolutely foolish vow, namely that he will offer as a sacrifice the first living thing to greet him after his return, should he be victorious in battle, and his only daughter comes out to greet him. Handel's setting of that, it's so universal, it's so beautiful. And there's a chorus, one of the greatest choruses ever written at the end of Part 2 of Jephthah, which begins with the chorus simply not understanding this tragedy. It makes no sense. Thy dark deeds, O Lord, are hid from human sight. And it ends, it's a 4-part chorus, it ends with the chorus convincing itself that it has to accept whatever happens. And he ends by quoting a famous line from Alexander Pope, whatever is right, the last line of the essay on man. And yet you get the sense the chorus doesn't really believe it. They've just pushed themselves because the tragedy is so overwhelming, so incomprehensible. Now that is just a thrilling chorus, and again, it's hard to put into words, but when I was singing that chorus, and there was a beautiful performance, everything was working well, I had that feeling. Another time I had it was a previous
What kind of
time.
feeling is it?
What can I tell
had
you?
that feeling.
No,
it's
that's
not good enough.
It's transcendence. It's not puttable into words. People have been struggling for years. It's the feeling that everything is right and beautiful, and that there's decency in this world, and everything fits, and That's terrific. Many years ago, I was singing this same piece, and I had the same feeling at a very odd time, because you know the St. John Passion ends with a great chorus, Ruht wohl, rest well. But then at the end, there's this chorale. You would think it's just, why does he have a chorale at the very end of the Passion? It sounds like just an ordinary hymn, but that chorale is so affirmative. It's so four square. It's so stolid, and our conductor conducted it so beautifully that somehow I understood that this is not just attached on. It really has a meaning and a purpose. So there are moments. It's always good, but there are great moments.